The sand was in everything. His eyes, his lungs, his weapon, his soul. Staff Sergeant Ray Mitchell couldn't see 3 feet in front of his face. The RH-53D Sea Stallion was bucking through the haboob like a drunk horse, and somewhere in the orange-brown murk ahead, 7 other helicopters were supposed to be flying the same blind path toward a staging area codenamed Desert 1. It was April 24th, 1980. Mitchell was a Delta Force operator on the unit's first real-world mission, part of the assault team that would rescue 53 American hostages from the embassy in Tehran. He had trained for this for 18 months. He had rehearsed every room clearing, every contingency, every possible scenario Colonel Beckwith could imagine. No one had rehearsed flying through a wall of sand so thick it turned night into something worse than darkness. "How much longer?" Mitchell shouted to the crew chief. The Marine shook his head. He didn't know. No one knew. They were flying on instruments through conditions that instruments weren't designed for, and the mission that was supposed to restore American honor was already coming apart at the seams. 3,000 miles away, in a terraced house in Hereford, England, Sergeant David Hayward of the 22 Special Air Service Regiment was watching the American hostage crisis unfold on the evening news. The BBC was reporting that negotiations with Iran had stalled again, that the American hostages had now been held for 172 days, that President Carter was under enormous pressure to do anything to bring his people home. Hayward knew what that meant. The Americans were going to try something. They were going to launch some kind of rescue operation, and based on everything he knew about American special operations, they were going to make it far too complicated. "They'll cock it up," said Sergeant Tommy Walsh, sitting next to Hayward in the SAS recreation room. "Too many moving parts, too many services trying to coordinate. Mark my words." Hayward didn't argue. He had worked with American Special Forces during joint training exercises, had seen how they operated. Brave men, certainly. Well-equipped. Absolutely. But they had a tendency to over-engineer everything, to add complexity where simplicity would serve better, to trust technology and firepower over patience and judgment. "Maybe they'll surprise us," Hayward said, though he didn't believe it. Walsh snorted. "When have the Yanks ever surprised anyone with restraint?" Hayward would remember that conversation for the rest of his life. Not because Walsh had been right, though he had been catastrophically right, but because of what happened 11 days later. What happened in London. What the SAS would do in 17 minutes that American Special Forces couldn't accomplish in 6 months of planning. But first, the Americans had to fail, and fail they did. The first helicopter turned back 2 hours into the flight. Instrument failure in the dust storm. The pilot couldn't navigate, couldn't see, couldn't do anything except reverse course and pray he found the carrier again before his fuel ran out. Mitchell's helicopter pressed on. So did the others. 6 aircraft remaining out of 8, the absolute minimum number required for the mission to proceed. When they finally emerged from the haboob and descended toward Desert 1, Mitchell felt the first flicker of hope he'd experienced since takeoff. They had made it. The staging area was below them, the C-130 transports already on the ground, fuel bladders waiting to be pumped into helicopter tanks, Delta operators checking their weapons for the assault on Tehran. Then the crew chief's voice cut through the rotor noise. "We've got a problem." Helicopter number 2 had developed a hydraulic leak during the dust storm. The system was failing. The aircraft couldn't continue to Tehran. 5 helicopters. The mission required 6. Mitchell watched through the open door as Colonel Charlie Beckwith, the Delta Force commander who had created the unit from nothing, argued with helicopter pilots on the desert floor. Even from 50 meters away, Mitchell could see the tension in Beckwith's posture, the way he kept gesturing toward the remaining aircraft, the way the pilots kept shaking their heads. Beckwith was a legend. He had served with the British SAS during the Malayan emergency, had lived and fought alongside them for nearly a year, had returned to America convinced that the United States needed a similar unit. He had spent a decade convincing the Pentagon that special operations required specialized soldiers, not just any infantry with extra training, but men selected and developed for missions that conventional forces couldn't execute. Delta Force was his creation, his life's work, his answer to the SAS. And now, Mitchell was watching that life's work collapse in a desert 800 miles from the nearest American base. "We can do it with 5, one of the pilots said, his voice carrying across the staging area. "We can make it work, sir." Beckwith shook his head. The plan requires 6. If we lose one more bird en route to Tehran, we're stranded in a hostile city with no extraction. So we adjust the plan. There is no adjusted plan. There's the plan we rehearsed for 6 months, or there's nothing. Mitchell would remember that exchange for the rest of his life. The look on Beckwith's face as he realized that everything he had built, everything he had fought for, was about to collapse, not because of enemy action, but because of mechanical failure and sand, and a planning process that had left no margin for error. The abort order came from Washington 30 minutes later. President Carter himself, agonizing over the decision in the White House Situation Room, finally accepted that the mission could not proceed with 5 helicopters. Now they just had to get out of Iran. Getting out should have been simple. Load the aircraft, take off, fly back to the carrier. The enemy didn't even know they were there, but nothing about Operation Eagle Claw was simple. The staging area at Desert 1 was chaos. Helicopters and C-130s scattered across a makeshift airstrip, fuel bladders and equipment everywhere. 132 American servicemen trying to organize an evacuation in darkness, with sand still swirling from the earlier dust storm. Mitchell was helping load classified documents into a C-130 when he heard someone shout. He turned just in time to see Major James Schaefer's helicopter lifting off, trying to reposition to make room for the transport planes to depart. The rotor wash kicked up a blinding cloud of dust. Schaefer lost his reference points. The Sea Stallion drifted sideways. Mitchell threw himself to the ground before he consciously understood what was happening. The helicopter's rotor blades carved into a C-130 transport plane loaded with Delta operators and 6,000 gallons of aviation fuel. The fireball lit up the desert like a second sun. Mitchell felt the heat wash over him, singeing his eyebrows, cooking exposed skin. He heard screaming, men on fire, men trapped in wreckage, men watching their teammates burn. Ammunition was cooking off in the destroyed aircraft, rounds snapping through the air, shrapnel scything across the staging area. 8 Americans died in the explosion, 5 Air Force crew, 3 Marines. Men who had come to rescue hostages, and who would go home in flag-draped coffins without ever seeing Tehran. The retreat was chaos. The surviving helicopters were abandoned, no time to destroy them, no time to retrieve classified documents and equipment. The force piled onto the remaining C-130s and fled into the night, leaving 5 intact helicopters and the bodies of 8 American servicemen for the Iranians to find at dawn. Mitchell sat on the floor of the transport aircraft during the flight out, his back against the fuselage, staring at nothing. Around him, Delta operators who had spent 18 months preparing for this mission sat in stunned silence. Some were injured, some were crying, some wore the blank expressions of men who couldn't process what had just happened. Across the aircraft, Mitchell could see Colonel Beckwith sitting alone, his face unreadable. The man who had built Delta Force, who had promised America a unit that could match the SAS, was watching his dream burn. They had failed. Completely, catastrophically, publicly failed. And the whole world was about to find out. The news broke the next morning. President Carter went on television, his face gray with exhaustion and defeat, and admitted that a rescue mission had been attempted and had failed. Iranian state television broadcast footage of the burned helicopters, the American bodies, the classified documents that the fleeing force had left behind. Ayatollah Khomeini called it divine intervention. God himself had stopped the American assault, had sent sandstorms and mechanical failures to protect the Islamic Revolution. The American dead were evidence of divine judgment against the great Satan. In Hereford, Hayward watched the coverage with the rest of B Squadron, the SAS counter-terrorism team. No one spoke as the images played burned aircraft, American bodies, celebrating Iranian crowds. There was no mockery in the room, no satisfaction in being right about American overreach, just the grim recognition that men had died, that a mission had failed, that special operations forces everywhere would be judged by what had happened in the Iranian desert. Poor bastards, Walsh said quietly. They never had a chance. The plan was too complex, Hayward said. 8 helicopters, multiple staging areas, 4 different services trying to coordinate. Too many things that could go wrong. That's the American way, isn't it? Bigger is better. More is more. Hayward didn't respond. He was thinking about something else, about the hostage scenarios that SAS had trained for, about the simpler approaches that British doctrine emphasized. speed and surprise. Small teams. The willingness to accept limitations rather than building plans that required perfection. He didn't know it yet, but in 6 days he would have a chance to prove that the British way was better. The call came on April 30th, 1980. Hayward was in the SAS training facility, practicing room clearings with his team, when Captain Morrison appeared at the door. "Prince's Gate," Morrison said. "Iranian Embassy. Hostage situation. B Squadron is on alert." "How many hostages?" 26. 6 gunmen. "They're demanding the release of Arab prisoners from Iran." Hayward grabbed his gear. Around him, operators from B Squadron were doing the same, moving with the quiet efficiency of men who had rehearsed this response hundreds of times. Within 30 minutes, they were loading into vehicles, racing down the motorway toward London. The Iranian Embassy was a 5-story Georgian townhouse at number 16 Prince's Gate, in one of London's most exclusive neighborhoods. By the time the SAS arrived that evening, police had established a cordon, negotiators were in contact with the gunmen, and the world's media was gathering to document whatever happened next. The contrast with Operation Eagle Claw couldn't have been sharper. Where the Americans had planned a complex operation involving 8 helicopters and 6 aircraft in multiple staging areas across 800 miles of hostile territory, the SAS response to Prince's Gate was simple. Drive down from Hereford, set up next door, wait for orders. Hayward's team established their forward position in number 14 Prince's Gate, the Royal College of General Practitioners building 2 doors down from the embassy. From the upper windows, they could observe the target, study the layout, begin planning the assault that everyone hoped wouldn't be necessary. Lieutenant Colonel Mike Rose, the 22 SAS commanding officer, established his headquarters in a room overlooking the embassy's rear garden. Hayward found him there that first evening, studying architectural blueprints spread across a table, marking possible entry points and defensive positions. "What do we know about them, sir?" Hayward asked. 6 men, Iranian Arabs from Khuzestan province. They've got Scorpion submachine guns and hand grenades. They're holding the hostages on multiple floors. We're still trying to determine exactly where. And our approach? Rose looked up from the blueprints. Patience. We wait for the negotiators. We gather intelligence. We prepare multiple assault plans. And if they start killing hostages, we go in. How long do we wait? As long as it takes. Hayward nodded. This was the SAS way. No rushing, no pressure to act before conditions were right. They would watch, they would plan, they would rehearse, and when the moment came, if it came, they would execute with precision that left nothing to chance. Meanwhile, at Fort Bragg in North Carolina, Ray Mitchell was being debriefed for the 4th time about Operation Eagle Claw. The questions were always the same. What had he seen at Desert One? When had he first known something was wrong? What could have been done differently? Each session focused on a different aspect of the disaster helicopter maintenance, dust storm navigation, the decision-making process that had led to the abort. No one blamed Mitchell personally. He had done everything asked of him. But the weight of collective failure pressed down on everyone who had been there, and the debriefings felt less like fact-finding than flagellation. "What happens now, sir?" Mitchell asked his team leader after the 4th session. "We rebuild. We learn from what went wrong. We get ready for the next mission." "And the hostages?" The team leader's face tightened. "They're still in Tehran. Probably will be for months. Until this administration can negotiate a release, or until the next administration takes over." Mitchell thought about those 53 Americans, still captive, still waiting for a rescue that had failed before it reached them. He thought about the 8 men who had died, trying, their bodies returned to American soil, their families receiving folded flags and condolences that couldn't possibly be enough. He thought about Colonel Beckwith, somewhere in this building, probably blaming himself for a failure that had roots far deeper than any one man's decisions. "Do you think it would have worked?" Mitchell asked. "If we'd had 6 helicopters? If the dust storm hadn't hit? I don't know. Maybe." The team leader paused. "But here's the thing. We were always one failure away from disaster. One more helicopter breaking down. One guard at the embassy being in the wrong place. One piece of bad luck." The plan didn't have any margin for error, and in special operations, there's always error. So what do we do differently next time? That's what the brass is trying to figure out. But between you and me, we need to think smaller, simpler. The Brits do this better than we do. They don't try to solve every problem with more helicopters and more aircraft and more coordination. They accept their limitations and build plans that work within them. Mitchell would remember that conversation in 6 days, when he watched the SAS storm the Iranian Embassy in London, when he saw what simple could accomplish, when he understood finally what American special operations had been missing. The siege at Prince's Gate lasted 6 days. Hayward spent most of that time in preparation. The SAS established observation posts in adjacent buildings, lowered microphones down the embassy's chimneys, drilled holes through walls to plant listening devices. British gas engineers created noise cover by drilling in a nearby street, masking the sounds of SAS activity with the rumble of construction equipment. They interviewed released hostages the gunmen had let several go during negotiations, in exchange for the BBC broadcasting their demands. They debriefed the embassy caretaker, learning the layout of every room, the location of every door, the thickness of every window, and they rehearsed. At Hereford, a replica of the embassy's interior had been constructed, and teams practiced their assault routes until they could execute them blindfolded. Every door, every staircase, every room, they knew the building better than the terrorists who occupied it. On the 4th day, Hayward participated in a planning session that would shape the assault. The team studied the intelligence they had gathered, identified the likely positions of hostages and terrorists, developed primary and alternate approaches for every contingency. Red Team takes the upper floors, Captain Morrison explained, using a scale model of the embassy. We abseil from the roof, enter through second-floor windows. Blue Team takes the ground floor and basement, entering through the rear. Simultaneous assault, maximum violence, overwhelm them before they can react. What about the armored windows? Someone asked. The embassy had bulletproof glass installed on the lower floors. We'll use frame charges blow the entire window frame inward. Sledgehammers for the upper floors where the glass is normal. Rules of engagement. Any armed man is a legitimate target. We're not taking prisoners unless they surrender before the assault begins. Hayward absorbed the plan. It was elegant in its simplicity. 2 teams, 1 building, 30 seconds to establish control. No complicated staging areas, no 600-mile helicopter flights, no multiple aircraft requiring split-second coordination, just operators and a target. The contrast with Eagle Claw was deliberate. Everyone in that room had seen the footage from Iran, had studied the American failure, had understood exactly what happened when planning outran capability. The SAS assault on Prince's Gate would be the opposite, a demonstration of what Special Operations Forces could accomplish when they accepted limitations and built plans that worked within them. Inside the embassy, the situation was deteriorating. The 6 gunmen, young men in their 20s, most with little military training, were growing frustrated. Their demands weren't being met. The Iranian government showed no interest in releasing the prisoners they'd demanded. The British government made clear that safe passage out of the country wasn't an option. The terrorist leader was a 27-year-old named Awan Ali Mohammed, who went by the name Salim. He was the most experienced of the group, the one who communicated with police negotiators, the one who made decisions. But even Salim was in over his head. The operation had been planned and supplied by Iraqi intelligence. Saddam Hussein was eager to destabilize his Iranian neighbors, and the embassy siege was meant to embarrass the new Islamic Republic. But the execution was amateurish. The gunmen had brought weapons into Britain, but they had no clear exit strategy. They had hostages, but no understanding of how to use them as leverage against a government that had already decided not to negotiate. On the 6th day, May 5th, their patience broke. Hayward was in the Forward Operations Center when the report came through. Shots fired inside the embassy. 1 hostage confirmed dead, body being pushed out the front door. Abbas Lavasani, the embassy's press attaché, had drawn the terrorists' ire with his defiance. They had separated him from the other hostages hours earlier. Now his body lay on the pavement outside the embassy, a message to the British government that the gunmen were serious. Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher received the news in the Cabinet Office briefing room Cobra, the British government's crisis management center. She had been monitoring the situation for 6 days, resisting pressure to act while negotiators tried to find a peaceful resolution. But British policy was clear: negotiate as long as possible, but if hostages are killed, use force. The terrorists had crossed the line. At 7:07 in the evening, Thatcher authorized Operation Nimrod. Control of the situation passed from the Metropolitan Police to the Ministry of Defense. The SAS was ordered to go in. Hayward got the word from Captain Morrison. "It's on. Assault teams to positions. Execute in 16 minutes. 16 minutes. That was how long it would take to move all teams into position, to coordinate the simultaneous assault, to ensure that every operator knew exactly what he was doing and when. Hayward checked his equipment one final time. MP5 submachine gun, Browning high-power pistol, stun grenades, gas mask, frame charges for the windows. Around him, the other operators were doing the same, moving with the quiet efficiency of men who had prepared for this moment their entire careers. No speeches, no dramatic gestures, just professionals preparing to do their job. At 7:23, the assault began. The final preparations had been made with military precision. British gas had been drilling in a nearby street for days, providing noise cover as the SAS moved equipment and personnel into position. Aircraft taking off from Heathrow had been instructed to fly lower over the area, adding to the ambient noise that masked the soldiers' movements. On the roof of the embassy, Hayward and his red team prepared to descend. They wore black assault suits, gas masks, and communications headsets that linked them to every other element of the assault force. Below them, Blue Team was moving into position at the rear of the building. A stun grenade dropped through the skylight on the 4th floor, the signal to begin. Hayward stepped off the roof. Abseiling down the rear of a building while wearing full assault gear was a maneuver they had practiced hundreds of times. The rope sliding through gloved hands, the controlled descent toward the 2nd floor balcony, the moment of landing when you immediately transitioned from climber to assault team member. But the plans started going wrong almost immediately. Staff Sergeant Tom Morrell, leading the descent, became tangled in his ropes. One leg had somehow caught in the line, leaving him suspended against the building facade, unable to move up or down. And then one of the other operators, trying to help free Morrell, accidentally smashed a window with his boot. The sound of breaking glass echoed across the embassy's rear garden. Inside, terrorists who had been focused on the front of the building realized that something was happening behind them. Hayward made a split-second decision. "Continue the assault," he said into his radio. "Don't wait for Morrell. Go now." They couldn't use their explosives to breach the windows. The blast might injure their tangled comrade, still hanging helplessly against the building. Instead, Hayward and his teammates smashed through the windows with sledgehammers, crude but effective. Inside, chaos. Stun grenades were detonating throughout the building, filling rooms with blinding light and deafening noise. CS gas was being pumped through ventilation systems. Blue Team had breached the ground floor and was already clearing rooms, their MP5s crackling with controlled bursts. Hayward moved through the smoke, weapon up, scanning for threats. A bedroom empty, a bathroom empty, an office. 2 figures huddled in the corner, hands raised, faces twisted with terror. "Down, down, on your faces." The hostages complied instantly, pressing themselves to the floor while Hayward moved on. Behind him, another operator would secure them, verify their identities, ensure they stayed safe until the assault was complete. The first terrorist Hayward encountered was in a hallway, emerging from a room with a Scorpion submachine gun in his hands. The man's eyes were wide with confusion. The stun grenades had disoriented him. The gas was burning his lungs, and nothing in his limited training had prepared him for the violence that was engulfing the embassy. Hayward fired twice. The terrorist dropped. No hesitation, no warning, no attempt to negotiate. On the 1st floor, the terrorist leader Salim had heard the assault beginning and gone to investigate. He encountered PC Trevor Locke, the police officer who had been guarding the embassy when the siege began and had been a hostage ever since. Locke had kept a secret for 6 days. When the gunmen had searched him at the start of the siege, they had failed to find his service revolver, hidden beneath his jacket. For 144 hours, Locke had waited for an opportunity to use it. That opportunity had arrived. As Salim moved toward a window to see what was happening outside, Locke tackled him. The 2 men crashed to the floor, struggling for control, Locke trying to draw his pistol while Salim reached for his own weapon. SAS operators burst into the room seconds later. "Move! Get clear!" one of them shouted. Locke rolled away from Salim. The terrorist leader was still reaching for his weapon when the operators fired, killing him with a burst from their MP5s. Elsewhere in the building, the remaining terrorists were dying. The SAS swept through the embassy room by room, floor by floor, eliminating any armed resistance with the precision they had rehearsed thousands of times. In the telex room on the second floor, the terrorists guarding the male hostages realized the game was up. They could hear the gunfire, the explosions, the screams. They knew their comrades were dying. One of them, Shakir Abdullah Radal, made a decision that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. He raised his scorpion and opened fire on the hostages. Ali Akbar Samadzadeh was killed instantly. 2 other hostages were wounded before SAS operators burst through the door and cut Radhil down with a burst of automatic fire. It was the only moment during the assault when terrorists managed to harm their captives, a single desperate act of murder that accomplished nothing except adding one more body to the count. Hayward reached the telex room seconds after the shooting stopped. He saw the dead terrorist, the wounded hostages, the SAS operators already applying first aid. The scene was chaos, but controlled chaos. Everyone knew their role. Everyone was executing. Building clear, the call came over the radio. All terrorists neutralized except one. Repeat, 1 terrorist unaccounted for. The hostages were evacuated down the main staircase, flex cuffed for identification, led into the rear garden where SAS operators sorted out who was friendly and who wasn't. One of the hostages, Sim Harris, a BBC journalist who had been at the embassy to arrange visas, had been ordered to climb out a window during the assault. He would later describe the surreal experience of looking up to see a masked SAS operator pointing a submachine gun at him, while camera crews on the street below captured every moment. The 6th terrorist, Fauzi Nejad, had hidden among the hostages during the evacuation. He was identified in the rear garden by Sim Harris, a real hostage, pointing out a fake one. An SAS operator grabbed Nejad and began marching him back toward the embassy. The implication was clear. Another operator stopped him. "The world's watching, mate. Give him to the police." Nejad was handed over to Metropolitan Police officers. He would serve 27 years in British prison. The assault was over. From the first stun grenade to the last shot fired, exactly 17 minutes had elapsed. 19 hostages rescued, 5 terrorists killed, 1 terrorist captured, 1 hostage killed by terrorists. During the assault, 0 SAS fatalities, and every moment of it had been captured on live television. The British public had been watching the Snooker World Championship final, Cliff Thorburn versus Alex Higgins, at the Crucible Theatre in Sheffield, when the BBC cut away to show live footage from Prince's Gate. It was a bank holiday Monday. Millions of people were at home, relaxing, enjoying the spring evening. And suddenly their television screens were filled with black-clad soldiers abseiling down an embassy facade, explosions lighting up windows, flames pouring from rooms where stun grenades had ignited curtains. They watched Staff Sergeant Morel hanging helplessly in his ropes as fire climbed toward him, watched his colleagues desperately trying to cut him free, watched him finally drop to safety as the flames licked at the rope above him. They watched the windows shatter, the soldiers pour through, the smoke billow into the London sky. They watched hostages being led into the rear garden, flex-cuffed and searched, and wondered if they were witnessing a rescue or a massacre. And then they watched the survivors emerge, shaken but alive, and they understood what they had witnessed. Britain's elite special forces had just executed the most spectacular hostage rescue in history, in the heart of London, in front of the entire world. At Fort Bragg, Ray Mitchell watched the BBC coverage with the other Delta operators who had survived Desert One. The common room was silent as the footage played the abseiling soldiers, the explosions, the flames, the controlled violence that ended in 17 minutes. No one needed to say what everyone was thinking. The comparison was inescapable. 11 days. That was all that separated the American disaster from the British triumph. 11 days between 8 Americans dying in a desert fireball and 0 SAS soldiers dying in a successful hostage rescue. Colonel Beckwith was in the room, standing in the back, watching the coverage with an expression that Mitchell couldn't read. The man who had served with the SAS, who had modeled Delta Force on British methods, who had promised America a unit that could match the world's best special operations forces. He was watching the British demonstrate exactly what he had tried to build. "They made it look easy," someone muttered. Beckwith shook his head. "It wasn't easy. It was simple. There's a difference." "What do you mean, sir?" "They had one target, one building, one team that had trained together for years. They didn't have to coordinate helicopters and transports across 800 miles of hostile territory. They didn't have to worry about 4 different services that don't know how to talk to each other. Beckwith's voice was bitter, but honest. They did exactly what we tried to do. They just did it without the handicaps we gave ourselves. The room was silent. No one wanted to ask the obvious question: whose fault were those handicaps? Mitchell knew the answer, even if no one would say it out loud. The American system itself was broken, the inter-service rivalries, the bureaucratic complexity, the tendency to over-engineer every operation until it collapsed under its own weight. Desert One hadn't failed because of bad luck or bad weather. It had failed because the American military didn't know how to conduct joint special operations. The British had solved that problem. They had one unit, the SAS, that handled counter-terrorism from planning to execution. No coordination between services. No competing chains of command. No bureaucratic friction slowing every decision. That was the lesson of Prince's Gate. Not that British soldiers were braver or better trained than Americans, but that the British system allowed excellence to flourish where the American system strangled it. "So what do we do, sir?" Mitchell asked. "How do we fix this?" Beckwith turned to look at him. "We learn. We study what they did and how they did it. We build the kind of joint operations capability that we should have had before Eagle Claw." He paused. "It'll take years, maybe decades, but we'll get there. We have to." 2 weeks later, an SAS after-action report on Operation Nimrod circulated through NATO intelligence channels. Mitchell read it at Fort Bragg, studying every detail of the assault that had succeeded where Eagle Claw had failed. The report was clinical, professional, devoid of the gloating that Mitchell might have expected. It analyzed what had worked: simultaneous entry, overwhelming firepower, speed of execution, and what had gone wrong: Morell's entanglement, the broken window, the loss of tactical surprise. But the final paragraph cut deep. Operation Nimrod demonstrates the effectiveness of simple, well-rehearsed plans executed by integrated teams. The assault succeeded because SAS planning emphasized direct action by a single unit rather than complex coordination between multiple services. Recommendation: Allied Special Operations Forces should study Operation Nimrod as a model for hostage rescue operations. The American experience at Desert One, by contrast, demonstrates the catastrophic risks of over-engineered plans that require perfect execution across multiple domains. Mitchell threw the report across his desk. "They're right, and I hate them for it." His team leader picked up the scattered pages. "Being right doesn't make them any less arrogant." "No, but it does make us look like idiots." "We're not idiots. We're casualties of a system that wasn't ready for what we tried to do. And what do we do about it? We fix the system, or we wait for someone else to fix it. The fix would take 6 years. In 1986, the Goldwater-Nichols Act transformed American military organization, breaking down the service barriers that had contributed to Desert One. The following year, the United States Special Operations Command was established, giving Special Operations Forces their own unified command structure for the first time. The 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, the Night Stalkers, was created specifically to provide dedicated helicopter support for special operations missions. No more would Navy helicopters be flown by Marine pilots on Army missions. The Night Stalkers would train constantly with the units they supported, developing the integration that had been fatally absent at Desert One. Mitchell stayed with Delta through all of it. He watched the unit evolve, absorbing the lessons of 1980, building the capability that Beckwith had always envisioned. Each improvement was paid for by the failure at Desert One. Every training protocol, every coordination procedure, every piece of equipment traced back to what had gone wrong in the Iranian desert. In 1983, Mitchell deployed to Grenada with Task Force 123, part of Operation Urgent Fury. The mission was chaotic, poor intelligence, unexpected resistance, coordination problems that echoed Desert One, but Delta adapted, improvised, accomplished objectives despite the friction. In 1989, Mitchell was part of the Panama invasion, hunting Manuel Noriega through the chaos of a city under siege. The operation was smoother, the coordination better, the lessons of Desert One finally taking hold. By 1991, when Mitchell deployed to the Persian Gulf for Operation Desert Storm, American Special Operations looked nothing like it had 11 years earlier. The coordination worked. The helicopters arrived when and where they were supposed to. The missions succeeded. Mitchell thought about Prince's Gate often during those years. Thought about the 17 minutes that had defined what special operations should look like. Thought about the contrast between SAS efficiency and American chaos. He never met David Hayward. Their paths never crossed during joint training or combined operations. But Mitchell studied the after-action reports from every SAS operation that filtered through intelligence channels, looking for insights that might make American forces better. The SAS had earned their reputation at Prince's Gate. They had demonstrated what was possible when planning met execution, when training met reality, when a system was built to enable excellence rather than constrain it. American Special Operations was still learning, still evolving, still paying for the mistakes of Desert One, but they were getting better. Hayward stayed with the SAS through the 1980s and 90s, deploying to the Falklands, to Northern Ireland, to the Gulf War, to Bosnia. He rose from sergeant to warrant officer, from assault team member to team leader to training cadre. The fame that Prince's Gate brought to the SAS was unwelcome. The regiment had operated in obscurity for decades, and most of the men who had stormed the Iranian Embassy wished they could return to that anonymity. Instead, they found themselves on magazine covers, in newspaper profiles, in books and documentaries that stripped away the secrecy they valued. Foreign governments lined up to request SAS training for their own counterterrorism units. The West German GSG-9, the French GIGN, even American Delta Force, everyone wanted to learn from the men who had executed the most successful hostage rescue in history. Hayward spent 3 months at Fort Bragg in 1982, helping train Delta operators in close-quarters battle techniques. The Americans were eager students, hungry to learn, determined to rebuild their reputation after Desert One. The Delta operator assigned as Hayward's liaison was a staff sergeant named Ray Mitchell. Hayward didn't know, at first, that Mitchell had been at Desert One. The American didn't mention it, and Hayward didn't ask. They focused on the workroom clearing techniques, explosive breaching, the coordinated violence that had made Prince's Gate successful. It was Mitchell who finally brought it up, 3 weeks into the training exchange. They were in a Fort Bragg briefing room, reviewing footage of the Prince's Gate assault, when Mitchell said, "I was there, Desert One. I watched the helicopters burn." Hayward set down the remote control. "I didn't know. Not something I advertise." Mitchell's jaw was tight. "We were supposed to be the American SAS. That's what Beckwith promised. And then we failed on our first real mission, and 11 days later you lot showed the world what special operations actually looks like. The situations weren't comparable. You were 800 miles inside hostile territory. We were assaulting a building in central London. The principles are the same. Simple plans, integrated teams, the ability to adapt when things go wrong." Mitchell shook his head. "You had a man tangled in his ropes, a window smashed before you were ready, and you still completed the assault in 17 minutes with 0 friendly casualties. We had helicopters failing in a dust storm, and we left 8 men dead in the desert." Hayward considered his response carefully. The American was right, the principles were the same. But the execution gap between Eagle Claw and Nimrod wasn't about courage or training. It was about systems. "Your people are as brave as any I've served with," Hayward said. "The problem wasn't the operators. It was the structure they were forced to work within. The structure was supposed to give us capability. Instead, it gave you complexity. Too many services, too many chains of command, too many opportunities for friction." Hayward paused. "We had one team, one command, one objective. You had the Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marines, all trying to coordinate a mission that none of them could execute alone. So what do we do about it? You're already doing it. This training exchange, the SOCOM legislation moving through Congress, the Night Stalkers. You're building the integration that should have existed before Desert One. It's taking too long. Excellence always takes too long. The question is whether you keep building toward it or give up." Mitchell was quiet for a long moment. Then, "The report your people wrote after Nimrod, the one that said American forces shouldn't be assigned independent operations until our tactical approach evolves. Was that your assessment?" "I don't write reports." "But you agree with it?" Hayward met Mitchell's eyes. "I agreed with it in 1980. Your people were aggressive, but not smart. You had the best equipment in the world and didn't have the judgment to use it properly. And now?" Now, I watch Delta operators training, and I see something different. The aggression is still there. That's American nature, and you shouldn't try to change it. But there's something underneath it that wasn't there before. Patience, intelligence preparation, willingness to wait for the right moment. We're learning. Yes, you are. Mitchell and Hayward trained together for the remaining weeks of the exchange. They developed the kind of professional respect that forms between competent operators. Not friendship, exactly, but mutual recognition of capability and dedication. On Hayward's last day at Fort Bragg, Mitchell found him in the ready room, packing equipment for the flight back to Britain. "Thank you," Mitchell said, "for the training, for the honesty about what we need to fix. Just doing my job. No, you could have been arrogant about it. Could have treated us like failures who deserve to be mocked. Instead, you helped us get better." Mitchell extended his hand. "If we ever work together in the field, I'll trust you at my back." Hayward shook the offered hand. "Same to you. Just try to be a bit quieter about it." Mitchell laughed, the first genuine laugh Hayward had heard from him since learning about Desert One. "I'll do my best, but we're Americans. Quiet isn't really in our nature." "Then at least be loud and competent. The first part you've got. The second part is coming." The years passed. Mitchell continued his career with Delta, deploying to conflicts around the world, applying the lessons he had learned from failure and from training with British operators. Hayward continued with the SAS, watching American special operations evolve from the chaos of Desert One into something formidable. They never served together in the field. Their paths diverged into different theaters, different operations, different corners of the global war that Special Operations Forces waged in shadows. But they stayed in touch. Christmas cards, occasional letters, the quiet maintenance of a professional bond forged in shared understanding of what special operations demanded. In 2001, 19 years after their training exchange at Fort Bragg, both men watched the September 11th attacks unfold on television. Both understood immediately what it meant that Special Operations Forces would be the leading edge of America's response, that the skills they had spent careers developing would be needed as never before. Mitchell deployed to Afghanistan within weeks, part of the initial Delta presence that would hunt al-Qaeda alongside CIA paramilitary officers. Hayward's SAS team followed shortly after, joining the British contribution to Operation Enduring Freedom. They finally served together in late 2001, during the assault on Tora Bora. The mission was everything that Desert One had not been: American and British Special Operations Forces working in seamless coordination, supported by dedicated helicopters and integrated air power, hunting Osama bin Laden through mountain caves that should have been his tomb. Mitchell and Hayward didn't discuss their history during the operation. There was no time for reminiscence when you were crawling through cave systems looking for the most wanted man in the world. But they worked together with the trust they had built 19 years earlier, each knowing exactly what the other was capable of. Bin Laden escaped. The intelligence was wrong about his location, or he moved before the assault, or he found routes through the mountains that reconnaissance hadn't identified. The failure stung another target who slipped away, another mission that didn't achieve its ultimate objective. But the methodology was sound. The coordination worked. The lessons of Desert One had been absorbed, and American Special Operations Forces were performing at a level that would have been unimaginable in 1980. After Tora Bora, Mitchell found Hayward in the forward operating base, where both teams were recovering from the operation. 30 years since Prince's Gate next year, Mitchell said. 22 years since Desert One. We've both come a long way. Hayward nodded. Your people especially. I watched Delta during this operation, and I saw something I wouldn't have believed possible in 1980. Patience, intelligence, preparation, willingness to adapt when plans fell apart. We learned from our failures. You learned from everyone's failures, including ours. Is that what you call it? Ours? We're allies. Your failures become our lessons, same as our failures become yours. Hayward paused. The man who tangled his ropes at Prince's Gate? Tom Morell? He was nearly burned alive because our plan didn't account for what would happen if the abseil went wrong. We learned from that, changed our protocols, our equipment, our training. I didn't know that. No reason you would. We don't advertise our mistakes any more than you do. Hayward smiled slightly. But we make them. Everyone makes them. The question is whether you learn from them or repeat them. Mitchell thought about everything that had happened since 1980. The failures, the lessons, the slow transformation of American special operations from Desert One chaos to Tora Bora coordination. "We're not done learning," he said. "No, you're not. Neither are we." Hayward extended his hand. "But you're getting closer. Every year, every operation, you get closer to what you should have been from the beginning." Mitchell shook the hand. "And what's that?" "A force that matches your capability to your ambition. In 1980, you had enormous ambition and not enough capability. Now, the gap is closing. Thanks to people like you, the training, the honest assessments, the willingness to help us get better. We help each other. That's what allies do." They parted that night, returning to their respective teams, their respective wars. Mitchell would deploy to Iraq in 2003, would be part of the operation that captured Saddam Hussein, would continue building the American Special Operations capability that had risen from the ashes of Desert One. Hayward would deploy to Iraq and Afghanistan multiple times, would train a new generation of SAS operators, would watch American forces become the most capable special operations force in history. In 2011, Mitchell was retired, living in Virginia, when the news broke about the Abbottabad raid. He watched the coverage, the helicopter assault, the compound breach, the killing of Osama bin Laden, and he recognized what he was seeing. This was what American Special Operations had been building towards since 1980. This was the synthesis of American aggression and the lessons learned from British precision. This was the answer to every critic who had said Americans were too loud to survive or all the gear, no idea. 38 minutes, 0 friendly casualties, mission complete. Mitchell sent a text to a number in Wales, a retired SAS warrant officer named David Hayward, who had spent 3 months at Fort Bragg teaching Americans how to clear rooms and breach doors. "Watching the news from Abbottabad. You trained some of the men who did this. Thank you." The response came an hour later. "We trained together. This was all of us." Mitchell smiled at the message. Hayward was being generous. The Americans had executed the mission, had planned it, had flown into Pakistani airspace, and killed the most wanted man in the world. But the skills they had used, the methodology, the ability to adapt when the helicopter crashed, those came from decades of learning, from failures like Desert One and successes like Prince's Gate. The SEALs who killed bin Laden were the children of 1980. They had inherited the lessons that Desert One had taught in blood, that Prince's Gate had demonstrated in triumph. They had built something new from both traditions, American aggression tempered by British methodology, speed and violence guided by patience and preparation. The result spoke for itself. In 2015, Mitchell traveled to Britain for a special operations conference. He took a train to Wales, to a pub in a village he couldn't pronounce, where David Hayward was waiting with 2 pints already on the table. They talked for hours, about operations they could finally discuss now that decades had passed, about teammates who hadn't made it home, about the strange experience of being civilians after lifetimes spent in violence. They talked about 1980, about Desert One and Prince's Gate, about the 11 days that had defined special operations for a generation, about the lessons learned and the price paid. "I still think about it," Mitchell admitted. "Desert One, the fireball, the 8 men we left behind. It never goes away." "It's not supposed to go away," Hayward said. "That's how we honor them, by carrying them with us, by making sure their deaths meant something." Did they? Mean something? Look at what American Special Operations became. Look at Abbottabad. Those 8 men died in a failure that forced your military to change everything about how it conducts joint operations. Without Desert One, there's no SOCOM, no Night Stalkers, no Joint Special Operations Command. Without the failure, you never build the capability. That's a hell of a price to pay for capability. It's always a hell of a price. That's why we try to get it right. Hayward raised his glass. To the ones who paid. Hayward, to the ones who paid. They drank in silence. 2 old soldiers who had spent 35 years in a profession that demanded everything and gave back only memories. Near the end of the night, Mitchell asked the question he had been carrying for decades. That training exchange in '82, when you helped us rebuild after Desert One, why did you do it? You could have been arrogant, could have treated us like failures who deserved to be mocked. Instead, you helped us get better. Hayward set down his glass. Because we're not competitors. We're allies. Your failures hurt all of us. They make the West look weak. They embolden the people we're fighting. They cost lives that shouldn't have been lost. And our successes? Your successes strengthen all of us. When you killed bin Laden, it wasn't just an American victory. It was a victory for everyone who had trained together, learned together, built something together over 30 years. Hayward paused. That's what special operations is supposed to be. Not nations competing for glory, nations cooperating for results. Not everyone sees it that way. No. But the operators do. The men who actually do the work, who bleed together and train together and bury teammates together, we understand that this is bigger than flags and anthems. Hayward smiled. You Americans are loud. You're aggressive. You're sometimes too confident in your own capability. But you're also brave and dedicated and willing to learn from your mistakes. Those are the qualities that matter. Even when we fail spectacularly, especially then, anyone can succeed when everything goes right. The measure of a force is how it responds to failure, and you responded by building something that no one else in the world can match. Mitchell thought about that as the train carried him back to London the next morning. 35 years since Desert One. 35 years since Prince's Gate. A lifetime of operations, of lessons, of the slow building of capability that had finally produced Abbottabad. The SAS had shown the way in 1980, 17 minutes, that demonstrated what special operations could achieve when execution matched planning. America had learned. Slowly, painfully, expensively, but they had learned. And the men who had taught them, who had criticized them, who had helped them get better, those men understood what the transformation meant. The world's most powerful military had become the world's most capable special operations force. The chaos of Desert One had evolved into the precision of Abbottabad, American aggression, tempered by British lessons. Speed and violence, guided by patience and judgment. The synthesis that 1980 had demanded, that decades of partnership had produced, that the killing of Osama bin Laden had proven beyond any doubt. 17 minutes in London had shown what was possible. 38 minutes in Pakistan had proven that the Americans had finally understood. And in a pub in Wales, two old soldiers who had spent their lives building that understanding raised their glasses one final time. To the lessons learned, to the price paid, to the partnership that had made both nations stronger, to 17 minutes that changed everything, and the 30 years of work that followed.